My name is Claire Monroe. I'm a pediatric nurse, a wife, and a mother. At least I was until my daughter Grace died in her sleep. But the most painful part wasn't losing her. It was burying her alone while my parents were drinking champagne. At my brother's pool party, they said, "It's just a baby. Your brother's party matters more. You can always have another one." That day, I didn't just lose my child. I lost the last shred of belief that I mattered to the people who raised me, and they had no idea what I would do next. The wind was sharp that morning, cold, biting as if the sky itself had turned its back on me. I stood at the edge of a small white casket, surrounded by rows of folding chairs and quiet murmurs. People kept their coats buttoned tight, their hands buried in pockets, their eyes avoiding mine. I couldn't blame them. What do you say to a mother who's about to bury her infant daughter, Thomas? My husband stood beside me, his face pale, his grip on my hand like a lifeline. His parents were there too. Margaret wept openly, pressing tissues to her lips. Harold remained stoic, but his eyes were glassy red-rimmed. I looked around, scanning every face. My high school friend Sharon had flown in from Chicago. One of my nursing supervisors came carrying a tray of homemade lemon bars I knew I'd never eat. Even two of my former patients' parents showed up. Standing respectfully in the back, heads bowed, but the seats reserved at the front, those labeled grandparents, remained empty. Denise and Alan Monroe, my parents, didn't come. Not to the hospital, not to our house, not to this funeral. They had other plans that morning: floating candles, beach towels, and dozens of Instagram stories tagged Waikekink, engaged, and blessed. I know because I saw them. An hour after we lowered Grace into the earth, I opened my phone. I don't know why. I guess I was looking for something, anything, that would distract me from the hole that had been carved out of my chest. And the first photo I saw, my mother in a wide-brimmed hat sipping champagne beside the pool, my father shirtless laughing with friends, and in the corner of the image, a pink banner fluttering above them. "Congratulations, Eric and Kimberly." I blinked, my hands trembled. I could still feel the dirt on my fingers from where I had thrown it handful by handful onto my daughter's coffin. Grace was 7 months old. She had my eyes. She used to giggle when the mobile above her crib spun too fast. She had a favorite song. She loved the color yellow. She was real. And yet to my parents, she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict, a missed party. It wasn't the first time they had made me feel small, forgotten, replaceable. But it was the first time I realized they would never change. Not for me, not for Grace, not even for a death. So I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped trying to make them love me. And I started gathering the truth, not to hurt them, but to make sure they could never bury the memory of Grace the way they buried me. Because this time, I was the one writing the story. People say grief magnifies what's already there. But for me, the funeral didn't awaken something new. It just confirmed what I'd felt my whole life, that I was always optional. When I was 7, I asked for a birthday cake shaped like a sunflower. I reminded my parents every week. I even drew a picture and taped it to the fridge. The morning of my birthday, I ran to the kitchen in my pajamas, heart pounding. But the kitchen was empty. No cake, no candles. Denise was on a phone call. Alan was packing tennis gear for Eric. They had a tournament to get to. I spent that birthday eating leftover spaghetti and blowing out the scented candle in the bathroom by myself. At 12, I won my school's writing contest. It was the first time a teacher told me I had a gift. I invited my parents to the awards ceremony. They sat in the back for 15 minutes, clapped once, and then slipped out the side door. Eric had practice, and according to my mother, he's got real potential, Claire. Writing is cute, but tennis could get him into college. The same thing happened again on my graduation day. High school, class of 2011. I was the valedictorian. I spent weeks rehearsing my speech. My English teacher helped me with the final draft. I wore the only dress my aunt had ever bought me, and for the first time, I felt like maybe I was worth showing up for. But as I took the podium, I saw my parents whispering to each other. My father checked his watch. The moment I said my first sentence, they stood up and walked out. Eric had a regional tennis final. He wasn't even playing, he was coaching a younger teammate. But that mattered more. Every single time I needed them, there was always someone more important. It was never loud, never cruel, just quiet rejections, silent reminders that I was never the center of their orbit. And like any child desperate for love, I adapted. I clapped for Eric. I cheered at matches. I kept my own victories to myself, because when you're constantly reminded that you are not the priority, you start to believe it. By the time I turned 21, I'd mastered the art of disappearing in a room full of people. I wore neutral colors. I didn't argue. I became the kind of daughter that never caused problems, never demanded attention. But grief doesn't let you stay hidden. It rips the curtain down and throws you into the center of the stage. That's why when I stood over Grace's grave, I wasn't just mourning my daughter. I was mourning the little girl I used to be, the one who thought if she just behaved well enough, stayed quiet enough, loved deeply enough, maybe her parents would finally notice her. Spoiler, they didn't. But for the first time in my life, I noticed me, and I was no longer willing to be the background character in my own story. I hadn't planned on checking my phone that morning. After the funeral, I wanted silence, no calls, no texts, no noise, but the world doesn't stop when your heart does. I opened it out of habit, maybe to feel something normal, maybe to find some message, any message from Denise or Alan. What I found instead was a firestorm. A friend had sent me a link. "Have you seen this?" she wrote. I tapped it. It was a post on a local parenting forum, anonymous but already spreading. The headline punched me in the chest. "Some people shouldn't be mothers." I scrolled down slowly, my breath caught somewhere between my throat and my ribs. The author described a young mother, reckless, absent-minded, unfit. She claimed the baby had shown signs of illness days earlier, and the mother chose to ignore it in favor of wine nights and journaling. She wrote, "You don't get sympathy when you kill your own child through negligence." My vision blurred, my hands trembled, but then I saw it, the detail that snapped everything into place. She even named the baby after a character in a novel she liked in college. Not family, not tradition, just her ego, Grace. Only a handful of people knew that. Only people close to me. This wasn't just a cruel article, it was written about me. Someone somewhere had taken the worst moment of my life and weaponized it. And the worst part? People believed it. The comments poured in. Where were the grandparents? Why didn't the family step in? Sounds like she wanted a baby for attention. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, reading every line like a sentence carved into my skin. Not one of them knew the truth. Not one knew about the nights I stayed awake watching Grace breathe, or how I'd called the pediatrician twice the week before, only to be told it was a mild cold. They didn't know I held her when she stopped breathing, that I begged her to come back before the ambulance even arrived. But now I was the woman who buried her baby and blamed everyone else. Somewhere out there, someone was rewriting my pain, and people were nodding along. And that's when something shifted inside me. I'd buried my daughter alone, but I would not let them bury the truth next. This wasn't about sympathy anymore. It was about justice for Grace, and maybe finally, for me. I was never the girl anyone expected to do anything remarkable. Quiet, average grades, always sitting in the second row, not the front, not the back. But I liked helping people. That part came naturally. I didn't care for attention, I cared for relief. That's what led me to nursing. I still remember the day I got accepted into the program. My hands shook as I held the letter. I looked up to tell someone, and there was no one there. No balloons, no congratulations. Denise said, "Oh, that's nice," before asking if I could pick up Eric from practice. So I celebrated alone. And then I built a life that no one thought I could. Nursing school was hard, but it gave me a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. Every patient, every night, shift, every scar I cleaned reminded me I mattered. That's also where I met Thomas. He was working hospital security while studying to be a paramedic. He brought granola bars to the night nurses. He remembered names, and he noticed me, not the polished version, The tired hair in a bun, shadows under my eyes version. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, he found me in the staff lounge, crying quietly over a sandwich. He didn't say anything, just sat nearby and slid over a warm cup of tea. No questions, no comments, just presence. I married that presence 3 years later. Thomas didn't come from money, but he came from kindness. His parents, Margaret and Henry, welcomed me like I was already theirs. On our engagement night, Margaret held my hand and said, "We're so lucky to have you." No one had ever said that to me before. At the wedding, my parents sat stiffly, whispering among themselves about the shrimp being overcooked and how Eric's speech deserved more applause. But I didn't care, because on that day, I finally belonged somewhere. Thomas and I built a quiet little life. We rented a small house on the edge of town. I took evening shifts so I could cook breakfast with him. He'd bring home flowers from the discount stand, always saying, "You deserve the ones they don't price right." And then we started dreaming of Grace. It didn't happen right away. There were months of waiting, then doctors, then more waiting. But through it all, Thomas never flinched. He'd whisper to my stomach, even when it wasn't showing, "Hi, it's Dad. We're ready whenever you are." And when that pink line finally appeared, I cried in the bathroom for 15 minutes, then again in the living room, then in the kitchen, because for the first time in my life, someone was going to need me first. Pregnancy was supposed to be this sacred time, a pause in the noise of the world, and with Thomas's family, it truly was. Margaret brought over casseroles every Tuesday. She left them on the porch with little notes like, "Don't forget to eat," and "Your body's working hard." Henry built a wooden cradle by hand. It took him weeks. He sanded every corner twice, so the baby's skin wouldn't ever meet a splinter. Even Thomas's younger sister, Ellie, who had always seemed too cool to care, started sending me baby name ideas. "What about Grace?" she texted. "It means favor." I cried when I read it. Not because I had decided on the name, but because someone had thought far enough into our child's future to imagine her name. But when I told my own parents, Denise barely looked up from her phone. "Pregnant. Already. You sure it's a good time? Claire, you're not even 30 yet." And Alan, my father, he just nodded and asked, "So, does Eric know?" They asked if Eric knew. Not how I was feeling, not if I needed help, not even a congratulations, just whether their golden boy had been informed. I tried to shrug it off, told myself they were awkward with emotions, told myself they'd warm up to the idea with time. I was wrong. The few times I visited the pregnancy barely came up. They talked about Eric's latest coaching contract, the new tennis court he was funding for his old school, the sports drink brand that wanted him for an ad. Even when I was 7 months along and waddling like a penguin, Denise said, "Claire, could you not wear that dress? You look swollen." Swollen. I wanted to scream that I was creating life inside me, that I was fighting nausea leg cramps and insomnia for a tiny heartbeat, that I was carrying their grandchild. But I didn't scream. Instead, I sat at their dinner table, smiled politely, and watched as they toasted to Eric's latest TV appearance. No one raised a glass to Grace, Thomas noticed. Of course he did. After one visit, he said, "Do they even realize you're having a baby?" I forced a laugh and replied, "Only if it interrupts one of Eric's interviews." I learned to stop expecting things from them. No questions about the nursery, no offers to help, no curiosity about the due date. When I showed them Grace's ultrasound photo, her tiny hand curled into a fist, Denise said, "Well, all babies look the same in those pictures." Alan nodded again, that empty, useless nod. And just like that, I stopped bringing her up, because it hurt too much to share joy with people who treated it like static noise, something to tune out until their favorite program came back on. Grace came into the world at 3:12 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday. 7 pounds 4 ounces, a soft wail that somehow calmed me more than startled. Thomas cried before I did. I just stared at this tiny being we made and whispered, "You're here." I didn't know I could feel that much love without bursting. The hospital room was cold, but she was warm. My arms, once unsure and shaking, fit perfectly around her, like my body had been waiting for this wait all along. Margaret was the first to arrive. She kissed my forehead, then Grace's. Henry brought a knit blanket, yellow and full of tiny suns. Ellie recorded the lullaby I used to hum in the break room and played it softly on her phone. Love poured in from every corner of Thomas's family. When my parents finally showed up, it was 2 days later. They came dressed like they were running errands. Denise handed me a tiny gift bag with a generic card inside. No name, written no note added. Alan gave Grace a stiff glance and muttered, "Looks like you." They stayed exactly 30 minutes. At minute 25, Alan's phone buzzed. He said, "We've got to leave soon. Eric's tennis banquet starts at 6 and traffic's a mess." Denise looked at her watch and nodded already halfway out the door. Not once did they hold Grace. Not once did they ask how I felt, or what the delivery was like, or if I'd eaten. Thomas stood behind me the whole time. His hand on my shoulder tightened every time they looked at their watches. And when the door finally clicked shut behind them, Thomas bent down and kissed my hair. "You don't deserve that," he whispered. I didn't cry that day, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had become familiar, expected. Instead, I picked up my phone and opened a new folder. I named it quietly for Grace, and in that folder, I began to document the forgotten birthdays, the passive comments, the way Denise called Grace it when talking to her friends, the photo she cropped Grace out of and posted anyway, the time Alan used my car but forgot the baby seat was in it, so he dumped it in the garage without telling me. I wrote them all down, not to keep score, but to stop gaslighting myself, to remember that it wasn't in my head. I needed proof, not for court, not for revenge, but for me, so that the next time I questioned if I was being too sensitive, I'd have something solid to say. And no, Claire, you're not imagining it. Thomas didn't know about the folder at first. It was my quiet archive, my collection of invisible bruises, and every entry hardened something in me, not hate, but resolve. I would love Grace with everything I had. And if the people who were supposed to love her couldn't show up for her first breath, then I would not expect them at her first steps, her first words, or her first birthday. I no longer needed to beg for crumbs. I had someone to protect now, and I would never let her feel the emptiness I had to grow up with. Grace had a runny nose that morning, nothing alarming, no fever, just a soft little sniffle that came and went with each breath. I called off work anyway. I wanted to be the one to wipe her nose, to read her the same picture book 3 times in a row, to kiss her forehead and check her temperature every hour, even if I knew it was fine. She wore her giraffe pajamas, the ones with one button missing. She loved those more than anything else in her drawer. I made her oatmeal with bananas, and she mashed most of it into her tray. She gave me that grin milk teeth barely showing and said, "Mama, no nap." And I laughed because she always said that, even though naps always won. By bedtime, she seemed better. Her cheeks were a little flushed, but she drank her water and asked for her bear. I held her longer than usual that night, rocked her until her tiny fingers slipped out of mine, whispered a prayer just in case, just in case. I don't remember what time I woke up. Maybe it was the silence. No cough, no soft babble, no rustling of sheets. Just stillness. I walked into her room barefoot. The hallway felt colder than usual. My hand reached for the door without thinking. I remember opening it and standing there. Her little body was curled on its side, one arm outstretched. The giraffes on her pajamas looked faded in the moonlight. I stepped closer, called her name once, softly. She didn't move. I whispered it again. Still nothing. When I touched her cheek, I froze. Not warm, not even cool, cold. Not the kind of cold you feel from a draft, but the kind that seeps into your bones and tells you something ancient and final. My hand shook. I placed it over her chest, willing myself not to panic. No rise, no fall. I tried again. I shook her gently, then harder. Called her name again, louder this time. Still nothing. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I didn't sob. I just stood there, my fingers trembling against the skin I had once carried inside me. I backed away slowly, like the walls might close in if I moved too fast. I sat on the floor. The giraffes blurred in my vision. I stared at them for what felt like years. I didn't pray. I didn't plead. I just breathed and felt the emptiness start where she used to be. Thomas came running when I called. He was faster than the ambulance. He tried CPR while I stood by, useless and frozen. The paramedics came. They confirmed what I already knew. Grace was gone. They asked if I wanted to ride along. I shook my head. Instead, I wrapped her in the knit yellow blanket her grandfather gave her the day she was born, the one with little suns. I held her for one last time. She didn't feel like herself anymore, but I held on anyway. Until they had to take her from me. The silence afterward wasn't just in the house, it was in me. Something had been ripped out, but cleanly, so no one could see the wound. That night, I didn't cry. I sat by her crib, stared at the wall, and said her name in my head until it lost its meaning. And in that stillness, I made a promise. Justice wouldn't come from sorrow. It would come from truth. I called my mother the morning after Grace died. I had rehearsed it in my head, not the words, but the tone. Calm, measured. I told myself it was better this way. If I didn't expect anything, I wouldn't be hurt. But I was wrong. She picked up on the second ring. "Hi, Claire," she said, cheerful, like it was any other Thursday. I was just texting Eric. "You know Saturday's his big pool party, right? We're so proud he's hosting the whole team at the new house." I swallowed hard. My mouth tasted like metal. Grace passed away last night. Silence. Not the shocked kind, the calculating kind, like she was weighing something in her head. Then came the words. Oh no, she said flatly. Oh, honey, that's unfortunate, but Saturday... She didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need her to. "Saturday's the party," she continued like the thought had been too heavy to carry in one breath. "You know how important this is for Eric's career. Scouts will be there. Press too. We can't miss it." I waited for her to catch herself, to say she didn't mean it that way, that of course she'd come, that she'd hold me like she used to when I was 6 and scared of thunder. But nothing came, not even a sigh. "It's just a baby, Claire," she added quietly. "Your brother's future matters more right now. You understand, don't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was open, but there was no air left inside me. Somewhere in the background, I heard my father's voice asking about catering. My mother muffled the phone and responded, "Tell them no peanuts." "Eric's allergic, remember." I hung up. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Something inside me went still, not cold, not burning, just quiet. They had chosen, not just now, but long before. This was only the latest entry in a book they'd been writing for years, and now I was finally reading it. Grace's funeral was held on a cloudy Saturday. A few of Thomas's cousins came. A neighbor dropped off flowers. My colleagues from the hospital sent a card. My parents didn't show. They didn't send anything. They didn't even call. People whispered, of course. They asked, "Where are Claire's parents?" And did something happen? I didn't answer. Because how do you explain that your daughter was worth 30 minutes once and nothing at all? Now I stood by the grave alone. The priest read the psalm. Thomas stood silently at my side, his hand gripping mine so tight I thought he might break bone. I stared at the casket, white, small, too small. They lowered it slowly like it might shatter from the wind. I kept my eyes on it. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't broken, but because the pain had sunk beneath the surface where no one could see. When the service ended, I stayed behind. Long after the last person left, I sat on the cold stone bench by the gravesite and replayed the phone call over and over in my head. "It's just a baby." That was the moment something changed. Not anger, not revenge, conviction. If they believed she was nothing, I would show them who she was, who I was, and what it meant to be forgotten by your own family. The morning of Grace's funeral, the sky was gray. Not raining, just heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Thomas pressed my hand as we stood by the front of the chapel. My legs felt like glass, breakable, hollow. People came, nurses from the hospital, neighbors who'd only met Grace once, even our old landlord. They came with flowers. Quiet tears whispered condolences. They hugged me like I was a widow, like I'd lost a husband. But no one asked where my parents were. They must have assumed they were grieving in private. maybe too heartbroken to attend, but I knew better. I stood beside Grace's tiny casket in silence. The scent of lilies surrounded me, sweet, thick, almost nauseating. I stared down at the white silk draped over her, and I didn't blink. Thomas's aunt squeezed my shoulder gently. "You're so brave," she whispered. I wasn't. I was numb. Somewhere in the crowd, someone sobbed. I heard the eulogy being read, but the words sounded far away, like a language I once knew. All I could think about was the empty pew behind me, the one I had left open for them. I had hoped some foolish childlike part of me that they might still come, that they would walk in late breathless eyes, wet with guilt and sorrow, but they didn't. No mother, no father, no brother, no one from the bloodline that gave me life. The priest finished the prayer. People lined up to place white roses on the casket. I stood back and let them go first. When it was my turn, I knelt, placed one rose at the corner of the lid, and whispered her name, not just for me, but for the silence that followed. Grace. I stood slowly, my knees stiff. As I walked back to my seat, I felt my phone buzz in my purse. I waited until the service was over, until the last handshake, the final "she's in a better place." I stepped outside under the dull, overcast sky and pulled out my phone. One message from Eric. Sorry about that. No punctuation. No mention of Grace. No, I wish I could have been there. Just 6 hollow words that felt more like a shrug than sympathy. I stared at the screen, then deleted it. Not out of rage, but because I didn't want that to be the last message tied to my daughter's name. There was no name in it at all, and that was the point, wasn't it? To them, she wasn't real. She was an inconvenience, a pause in their schedule. I looked up at the sky. The clouds hadn't moved. I placed the phone back in my purse, zipped it slowly, and turned to face the street. People say grief is loud. Mine wasn't. It was still. And in that stillness, something inside me clicked into place. They weren't going to remember her, so I would make sure the world did. Not through vengeance, but through truth. Through every paper they signed without reading. Through every right they thought they had over me. Grace would not be erased, not if I had anything to do with it. In the days after the funeral, I stopped answering calls. I wasn't ignoring anyone. I just didn't have anything left to say. Thomas gave me space. He cooked folded laundry, even refilled my tea without a word. But grief made the house feel too quiet, like Grace's giggles had been vacuumed out of the walls. One morning, I sat in the kitchen, scrolling mindlessly. Not to escape, just to feel something other than silence. That's when I found it. A post titled, "When a Child Dies and No One Cares." It was in a private grief group, anonymous like so many others, but this one, it read like someone had copied a page from my life. She wrote about giving birth alone, parents too busy to show up. She mentioned a child named L, short for Lily, a girl who died young, a funeral where the grandparents chose a beach weekend instead. My hands froze on the screen. There was a sentence that hit me in the gut. They said it was just a baby. But she was my whole life. I blinked, scrolled down. The replies were kind, compassionate, dozens of hearts. But one stood out. Someone commented, "You're not alone. I know who wrote this, and she deserves better." That was the first clue. I clicked the profile of the commenter, a woman named Julia. Her page was public. Nothing dramatic, just photos of pets' hikes and occasional recipes. But one post made me pause, a group picture at a dinner table, and there, on the edge, smiling nervously, Kimberly, Eric's wife. I zoomed in to be sure. It was her, same soft brown curls, same dimple on the left cheek, and suddenly the puzzle made sense. Kimberly had written that post, not as an attack, not even as gossip, but as a quiet confession. She had been watching all along. The baby named Lily wasn't real, but Grace was. And Kimberly had seen what my family refused to see. I clicked back to the grief forum. The post had no comments from her directly, just the anonymous writing, but the tone, it was too intimate to be invented, too detailed. The guilt, the secondhand shame. It bled through every word. I stared at the screen. For the first time since Grace died, my breath caught not from sorrow, but from clarity. Someone knew the truth. And not just anyone, someone inside the house, someone invited to the family barbecue, While I sat alone in a chapel, I wasn't sure what to feel. Anger, gratitude, confusion. But I knew what I had to do. I sent Julia a private message. "Hi, I read the post about Lily. I think we need to talk." Then I waited. My heart beat faster than it had in days. Not because I expected revenge, but because something finally cracked open. Not in my heart, but in the silence that surrounded it. Kimberly's post wasn't the beginning of a fight. It was the end of pretending. And I was done pretending too. When I emailed Victor, I didn't expect a reply so soon. But within the hour, he answered, "If what you're saying is true, we need to meet." Victor wasn't a friend. He was a journalist I once met through Thomas, someone who believed in documenting silence, not just noise, the kind of person who saw value in overlooked stories. We met at a small cafe near the hospital where I used to work. He was already seated, notebook out, pen uncapped, eyes steady. I sat down, my palms slightly damp, not from nerves, from weight of everything I was about to unload. I didn't start with Grace. I started with my mother, her voice on the phone that day, her words, "It's just a baby." I told him about the 30-minute hospital visit after I gave birth, how they brought no flowers, no gift, no eye contact. Then I pulled out my phone. I've kept things I said, messages, emails, photos. I didn't know why at the time. I just couldn't delete them. Victor nodded once, inviting me to continue. I opened the first album, screenshots, a birthday message meant for Eric sent to me, a text, "Hope your year is bright, champ." No mention of me. I had turned 27 that day. Another message. I had told Mom I was starting night shifts as a nurse. She replied, "Try not to miss Eric's game on Saturday." Victor leaned in. Then I showed him the picture Grace's first birthday. A pink frosted cake, balloons from Thomas's parents, and one empty chair. I had saved the voicemail from my mother that day. "Sorry we couldn't make it. Eric's new girlfriend came over. You understand." I didn't delete that either. I kept playing them, not out of spite, but because they were real. Because if I didn't show them, no one would believe they existed. Victor's face didn't change, but he kept writing, word after word. Then I handed him the printout. My list. I had titled it, "What I Wish They Had Seen." It had dates, events, notes in the margins. July 3rd, Grace's checkup, no reply to invite. August 14th, texted Mom. Grace had her first word. She changed subject to Eric's new job. December 25th, no visit, just a forwarded meme. Victor looked up. "And you're okay with me?" Using this, I nodded. "As long as you protect Grace's name, tell the truth. But don't make it about pity." He tapped his pen on the notebook. "Then we'll need more. Photos, receipts, anything that shows a pattern, not just a moment." I smiled for the first time in days. "I've got boxes," I said. "You'll need time." He paused. "And Claire, this will stir things. Your family might react." I met his eyes. They had a chance to show up. They chose not to. Now they don't get to choose how the story is told. As I left the cafe, I felt something unfamiliar. Not rage, not relief. It was control. For the first time since Grace died, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something, quietly, deliberately. Not revenge, a record. And that was only the beginning. The article went live at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday. By 9:13, it had been shared over 4,000 times. Victor kept his word. He didn't name Grace. He didn't use my parents' names either. But the details, they were unmistakable. A grieving mother left to bury her child alone while her family attended a pool party. I refreshed the page, watching the numbers climb, likes, comments, shares, but it wasn't the stats that made my hands tremble. It was the replies. Strangers saying, "I remember a party like that." Former co-workers of my father writing, "We always thought something was off." Old high school friends of Eric typing, "I saw him post pictures that day. I thought it was weird." Then came the second wave, texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "Claire, is that real? I'm sorry. I never knew. Your parents always said you moved away by choice." I didn't reply. I just sat still on the living room floor, Grace's photo in my hand, as the world started connecting the dots I'd carried in silence. By noon, my father's business page had its reviews shut down. One comment stood out. "If you can't show up for your daughter's funeral, how can I trust you with my contracts?" It hit harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was fair. Thomas walked in mid-afternoon holding his phone. "You saw this." He showed me a university statement. Eric had been suspended from coaching duties pending review of recent allegations and public behavior inconsistent with our community values. They didn't use the word funeral, but they didn't have to. The truth had a way of showing up without knocking. Victor called that night. "Are you okay?" he asked. I paused, then told him the truth. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but I don't. I feel exposed, seen, and for once not invisible. He understood. Sometimes justice doesn't feel like fireworks. It just feels like clarity. I stared at the screen long after we ended the call. I wasn't proud of their shame. I wasn't glad they were hurting, but for the first time they were hurting for something they did not, something I failed to be. And that mattered, not for revenge, for Grace, because her name had been buried too soon. And now it lived on in every word, shared every mother who whispered I would have shown up. I printed the article and placed it in Grace's memory box alongside her hospital bracelet, a lock of hair, and the first letter she would never read. And I whispered, "You were never invisible." That night, I didn't cry. I just listened to the quiet. A different kind of silence, one that finally made space for truth. My phone rang just past midnight. I almost didn't pick up. The number wasn't saved, but I knew. I knew the voice before it spoke. Claire Eric's voice was tight, clipped with fury. "How dare you smear our family's name like this?" I didn't answer immediately. I was standing by the window looking out into the dark. The same darkness I had stared into the night. "Grace died. I asked you a question." He said louder, "You went too far. You ruined Dad's business. You've humiliated Mom. People are turning on us." I finally spoke. "No," I said softly. "I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped pretending." There was silence on the other end. I continued, "You're angry because now the world sees what I lived with for 30 years. You're angry because for once I'm not silent." Eric scoffed. "You make it sound like we abandoned you, like we were monsters." "You didn't abandon me," I said. "You erased me, slowly, consistently. And when Grace died, when my daughter died, you made it clear I was never part of this family." I heard him inhale sharply. "It was one party," he hissed. "One mistake." "No," I said firmly. "It was one lifetime." I took a deep breath. "Do you know what Mom said when I called to tell her Grace was gone?" She said, "Saturday's Eric's pool party." That's all, not even Grace's name. Not once. Eric was quiet now. I could feel him searching for a defense, for a justification that wouldn't sound hollow. "You didn't have to go public," he said finally. "You didn't have to destroy everything." "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I uncovered it." "You think the world turned against you because of me?" "No, the world just finally saw who you are. Who you all are without the filters." A long pause. Then his voice came back brittle. "Why now? Why do this now?" And I said it, because Grace deserved someone who would fight for her, who wouldn't let her be forgotten. Another pause. "You know what hurts most," I said. "It's not that you weren't there at her funeral. It's that I wasn't even surprised." There was a click. He hung up, and I stood there, phone still in my hand, heart still steady. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt, finished. Not done. Just finished with waiting for them to change. Finished with shrinking myself so they'd feel big. Finished with apologizing for being the daughter they never wanted. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about presence. Grace didn't have a voice anymore, so I used mine. And if that made me the villain in their story, then so be it. Because for the first time, I was the hero in mine. It was late afternoon when the knock came. I opened the door, and there she was, Kimberly, polished, tired, carrying an expression I couldn't read. She held no phone, no notes, no excuse, just herself. "I'm not here to fight," she said. I didn't respond. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat down, but I stayed standing. "I saw the article," she began. "I know it hurt you. I crossed my arms. You think her eyes flinched, but she didn't back down. I didn't write it to shame you, Claire. I wrote it because I was angry, just not at you. That caught me off guard. She looked away, then back. You remember the baby shower when I was 8 months pregnant? I did. She had worn pink, smiled through every photo. My mother-in-law, her mother-in-law, was all over her. She pulled me aside that day, Kimberly said, put her hand on my stomach, and said verbatim, "You're just a walking womb. Don't get delusional. The baby is the asset here, not you." My breath caught. I sat down slowly. Kimberly's voice trembled now. "Claire, I was so humiliated. I cried the whole night, and then I watched her praise you to your face just to tear you down behind closed doors. I remembered the way she would compliment my parenting, then laugh with others about how Claire thinks changing diapers makes her special." Kimberly exhaled. "When Grace passed at your in-laws, they said, well, maybe Claire wasn't meant to be a mother. They didn't mourn. They judged." My throat tightened. "I wrote that article anonymously," she said, "to vent, to scream into the void. But it wasn't meant to go viral. It wasn't meant to become this." She paused. "I owe you an apology. Not just because it hurt you, but because I added to the silence. The same silence they've always used to erase people like us." I stared at her. For a moment, I saw not a woman who wronged me, but one who had also been silenced, labeled, minimized, like me. She stood up. "I'm sorry, Claire. I know sorry isn't enough, but I wanted you to know the article wasn't about your failures. It was about mine. My failure to speak up when it mattered." And then she left. No drama, no defense, just raw truth. I sat there long after she was gone, feeling everything at once. Anger, confusion, a flicker of understanding. In a twisted way, Kimberly's betrayal was born from the same wound as mine, not being heard, not being seen, reduced to roles stripped of humanity. I opened my laptop, searched for the article again, and for the first time, I didn't just see myself in it, I saw her too. The line, "She was never enough," didn't just haunt me, it haunted her too. I didn't forgive Kimberly that day, but I didn't send her away either. She stood in front of me, her eyes swollen with a kind of exhaustion that didn't just come from lack of sleep. It was guilt. It was shame. And it was something else, recognition. We had both been dragged through different versions of grief and somehow met here on this crooked path neither of us chose. "I wrote that post," she said, "not to hurt you, but because I had no voice when it happened to me." I said nothing. I wasn't ready to share my silence, but I didn't slam the door. Instead, I gestured for her to sit. I poured 2 cups of tea, not out of kindness, just to have something warm to hold so my fingers didn't turn cold like they had in the morgue that night. She told me everything. Her mother-in-law had once laughed in her face, said she was just a walking womb after a miscarriage. She hadn't even meant to write about me. It was just her rage bleeding into the shape of someone else's story. But when I saw the post go viral, she said, quietly, I panicked. I didn't know it would hurt a real person. A real person. I stared at her when she said that. Because in my own family, I wasn't one. I was a role, the invisible daughter, the reliable one, the one who didn't cry too loud or ask for too much. And when Grace died, they treated her like she'd been a dream. I had not a life I lost. I listened to Kimberly, and she listened to me. It wasn't a friendship. Not yet. It was 2 survivors holding the same wound from different angles. We began trading stories, not for comfort, but for truth. She showed me screenshots of other anonymous posts she'd seen about women like us, unseen, erased, rewritten by people with louder voices. I showed her the calendar where I'd circled every broken promise my parents made. We built a timeline, not to publish, but to make sense of the quiet abuse that wears a daughter down to nothing. We didn't say the word forgiveness. That would have been too simple. We said things like, "What did your mother say when you told her?" Or, "Did they come to the hospital?" Or, "I used to think if I was just better, they'd love me back." Each question chipped away at the wall between us. I didn't forget the article, but I started to understand the writer. Not every villain knows they are one. Not every victim stays broken. By the end of the week, we weren't friends. We were 2 women with unfinished chapters, and maybe just maybe a reason to co-author the next one, because justice, I realize, sometimes begins not in a courtroom, but in a living room over 2 cups of tea, where 2 women finally see each other clearly for the first time. I wasn't expecting mail that morning. Most days it was just bills, a few catalogs, or notes from the support group. But this envelope was different, thicker cream-colored and handwritten with a name I hadn't spoken out loud in weeks. Alan Whitmore, my father. I sat with it for a while. Did I even want to open it? He hadn't called, he hadn't texted, not even after the article went viral or after Eric's meltdown on the phone. For a man who'd always claimed to stay out of family drama, he had certainly mastered the art of disappearing when it mattered. But something about the weight of that envelope, it wasn't just paper. It was years of silence, of decisions made behind my back, of looking at his own daughter and not seeing a person. I opened it. The first line didn't start with "Dear Claire." It started with, "I won't ask you to forgive me." That stopped me. He continued, "I won't ask for your understanding either, not yet, because I know what I've done, or more precisely what I haven't done." I read the article, all of it, and for the first time I didn't see a stranger. I saw you. I saw Grace. My hands trembled. We were wrong. Your mother and I. We were wrong for choosing Eric's spotlight over your shadow. We were wrong for pretending that your quiet strength wasn't worth celebrating. We were wrong to make you feel like love was something you had to earn. I had to stop reading. The tears weren't loud, just slow. Not from pain, but from something else. A loosening, maybe. I picked the letter back up. When Grace was born, I came to the hospital because your mother said it would be rude not to. I stayed for 30 minutes because Eric had practice, but the truth is, when I held her, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Regret for not knowing how to hold you the same way when you were that small. I pressed my hand to my mouth. He remembered, not all of it, but enough. I watched that funeral from afar. We were parked 2 blocks down. Your mother didn't want to cause a scene, said it would be too awkward. I didn't argue. That might be my greatest shame. That I chose comfort over confrontation. That I let my own daughter bury her child alone. The letter closed with no plea. No come visit us, no promises of change. Just one line scratched shakily. If Grace were here, I'd want her to know her mother didn't break. She rose. I hope one day you'll allow me to witness that rising up close. But if not, I'll keep watching, from wherever you'll let me. I folded the letter. I didn't feel healed, but I felt seen. And maybe that was a start. Not of reconciliation, but of recognition. I didn't expect her to come alone. Denise had always been the kind of woman who moved in packs. Eric neighbors, relatives, always with someone else to absorb the weight of confrontation. But that afternoon, she showed up at my doorstep. Alone. She held something in her hand, small framed. I couldn't see what it was at first. She looked thinner, somehow, smaller. I didn't say anything. She didn't ask to come in. Instead, she handed me the frame. It was a photo of Grace, taken the day she turned 4, her favorite yellow sweater, that crooked paper crown Thomas helped her make. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she held it. I found this tucked in one of your old envelopes, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I'd forgotten I had it. I stared at her, not in anger, just disbelief. You kept a photo. I said slowly, but never came to her funeral. She winced. Then suddenly she sat down on the front step, as if her legs couldn't hold her anymore, and cried. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just these strange, jerky, helpless sobs that made her look nothing like the woman I knew. I don't know why I was so cold, she said. I don't know why, Claire. There it was. Not an apology, not a plea, just a sentence that had waited decades to come out. I was always drawn to the one who needed me least, she added, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Eric, he made me feel important. You were quiet. You didn't ask for much. And I mistook that for not needing me at all. I leaned against the door frame. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. Because inside me, the fury had already turned to something else, something heavier and quieter. She needed you, I said, finally pointing to the photo. Grace needed grandparents who showed up. She nodded, still crying. I know, she whispered. I know, and I can't fix it. I can't bring her back. We sat like that for minutes, maybe more. The woman who birthed me now, cracking open for the first time in her life, and me, no longer searching for answers, just witnessing. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure. And for once, silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like release. Forgiveness sounds noble until it's your own scars you're asked to overlook. In the quiet after Denise left, I sat on Grace's bed. I hadn't touched her toys in weeks, but that morning I picked up her stuffed lamb, the one she used to chew on while I fed her. I remembered her eyes, wide and still, like she was reading my soul each time she latched on her fingers, curled tightly around mine. It wasn't just feeding, it was our secret hour each morning, each night, where the world melted and only our breaths remained. No one ever told me grief had a texture, but it does. It's sticky, it clings, it colors everything you touch, smell, remember. That morning it smelled like baby lotion and distant sorrow. I ran my fingers across the edge of her blanket. That blanket, yellow with faded clouds, was older than her. A hand-me-down from my own childhood. I used to sleep under it when I was small, and suddenly, without warning, a different memory emerged. I was 10. It was raining. Denise had picked me up from school because the after-school bus broke down. We sat in the car for a few minutes in silence, windshield wipers tapping rhythmically like a nervous heartbeat. Then lightning cracked and I flinched. I don't know what possessed her, but she reached over and pulled me into her arms. It was clumsy, hesitant. But I remember the pressure of her hand behind my head. I remember the smell of her coat. And for a brief, trembling second, I thought maybe this is what love feels like. It never happened again. But that one time, it happened. And now I sat there cradling my own daughter's memory, wondering if Grace ever felt the same warmth from me. I hoped she did. I prayed she did. So when people asked me, will you forgive your parents? I never knew how to answer. Because the truth is, I didn't want revenge anymore. Not really. I wanted recognition. I wanted them to look at me not with regret, but with awareness, with understanding, with the weight of all they'd missed. And if that meant keeping a distance to preserve my peace, then maybe that was forgiveness in its own quiet form. I don't know if I'll ever embrace Denise again, but I remember her arms once, briefly, clumsily, and maybe that's enough for now. I didn't call them. I didn't text. I didn't even open the messages that started piling up after that last conversation. Instead, I bought a pack of paper, cream-colored thick, the kind you use when you want to say something that matters. I sat by the window, Grace's blanket folded neatly on my lap, and wrote the first word slowly, Dear Mom, Dear Dad. Then I paused. It took me 15 minutes to write the next sentence. I'm not ready. I let the ink dry before continuing. I know you want to talk. I know you want to explain. And maybe one day I'll be in a place where I can listen without flinching. But today is not that day. The words didn't come out of anger. They came from exhaustion, from years of holding things in, from pretending I was okay with being invisible. I took a breath, wrote on. Grace deserved more, and truthfully, so did I. I spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, loved strong enough, stayed silent long enough, you'd finally see me. You didn't. My hand trembled at that line. Not from pain, from clarity. I'm not writing this to hurt you. I'm writing because I can't keep performing in a version of this family where love is given only when it's convenient. I looked outside. The leaves had started to turn, golden brown Grace's favorite colors. I need time. I need space. I need to figure out who I am without constantly proving that I'm worth being loved. And I need to stop pretending like we're okay. We're not. I ended it simply. Claire. No dramatic goodbye. No list of demands. Just a truth laid bare finally. I placed the letters into 2 envelopes, one for my father, one for Denise. No return address. No note of invitation. Just truth. I mailed them the next morning. On the way back home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, but honesty. And sometimes that's the first step toward it. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock. Not hurried, not timid, just there. I opened the door, and there stood Eric, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, eyes tired in a way I'd never seen before. In his arms was a cardboard box, unmarked except for a tiny sticker that read, "For Grace." He didn't ask to come in, just looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he said, "I'm not here to fix anything." I stepped aside without a word. In the living room, he placed the box on the table, sat down across from me. I didn't offer tea. He didn't ask. He looked at the box. She loved puzzles, right? I nodded. He slowly opened the flaps. Inside were toys still in their packaging. A storybook with glittery pages. A doll with auburn hair. "I bought all this after Christmas," he said. I kept thinking I'd visit. Then something always came up. Work, travel, excuses. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked when he added, "I never opened it, not once." Silence. Then he looked up, directly at me. "You were always the one left behind, Claire. I got the spotlight, the birthday cakes, the applause. You got what was left, if anything at all." I said nothing. I couldn't. My throat had sealed itself shut. Eric leaned forward. "I used to think you were just quiet, cold even." I didn't realize it was the silence of someone trying not to scream. A long pause. Then, softer than I expected, he said I was the loved one. And I didn't know what that meant until I saw what you lived without. I finally spoke. "She died thinking she was enough. That was the only gift I gave her that I'm proud of." He nodded slowly. "You were enough too," he said. "We just never told you." I glanced at the box, the unopened pieces of a life that could have been. "What do I do with all this now?" I asked quietly. He looked down, then back at me. "Whatever you need to," he said. "Burn it, keep it, give it away." I didn't come to reclaim anything. I came to return it. There it was, the first act of accountability I'd seen from him. Not an apology, not a plea, just an offering. He stood to leave, paused at the door. "I won't contact you again," he said, "unless you ask." Then he was gone. I stood in the hallway for a long time after. The house was quiet but not hollow. The box sat where he left it, heavy in weight but heavier in meaning. I didn't open it, not yet, but for the first time, I didn't feel alone with it. Tuesday evenings began to take on a different meaning. What used to be the quietest time of my week, when Grace would have curled into me with a bedtime story, was now when I stood in front of a circle of folding chairs and said her name out loud. Grace. That was always how I started. No titles, no disclaimers, just her name, like a candle being lit. I didn't cry when I told our story. I didn't raise my voice. There was no bitterness in the way I described her first smile or the night she didn't wake up. Only clarity, like remembering the lyrics of an old lullaby. People listened, some with their eyes closed, some gripping tissues tightly. But I never asked them to feel sorry for me. I just asked them to remember her. I spoke about how she used to fall asleep with her hand on my cheek. I shared the silly way she pronounced caterpillar, calipilla. I told them how, even as she slipped away, her face looked peaceful. I never spoke about my parents in those meetings, not once. Not because I'd forgiven them, but because the story wasn't about them. Not anymore. It was about a little girl who taught me how to love without conditions. And it was about how I refused to let her become a footnote. Sometimes new members came into the group, carrying grief so fresh, it hadn't even settled into words yet. I saw myself in their tight shoulders, in the way their eyes darted toward the door, as if they might still hear footsteps returning. I never tried to fix anyone. I only listened. And when it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I am Claire. I lost my daughter, but I haven't lost my ability to speak her name. That line became a rhythm, a grounding truth. Some nights the room was silent for long stretches. Other nights it was full of broken voices and heavy breathing. But every single time I spoke of Grace, something softened in the room, something realigned. One evening, a woman named Lisa came up after the session and said, "I don't know how you do it without crying." I thought about it. Then I answered, because I cried when it mattered most. Now I just remember. She nodded and we stood together in the quiet for a while. I still went home alone, still passed by the unopened toy box Eric had left. But I felt less alone in my silence. Grace's name had filled a room, not with grief, but with light. And in that light, I found the strength to keep showing up, not to be heard, but to remember. Because remembering her out loud was the closest I'd come to bringing her back. I didn't expect her to show up again, not in person, not after everything. But on the third Tuesday since her article was published, Kimberly stayed after the session ended. She waited until everyone else had left, until the room was quiet, except for the soft sound of chairs being stacked and someone zipping a purse. I was wiping down the whiteboard when she approached me. "I hope it was okay," she said gently, "me being here." I nodded. "You didn't say anything out of turn." She smiled faintly, then looked down at her notebook, cradled in both hands like something sacred. "I didn't come to write another article. I came to understand what I didn't back then." I studied her face, less guarded now. The arrogance from before had softened. All that remained was a quiet tension, like someone trying to hold a fragile truth without breaking it. She added, "I still hear your voice when I reread the transcript. Not because I recorded you, because it stayed with me." I didn't respond. Not yet. Kimberly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I wrote something. For me, for her, but mostly for the record. She handed it to me. I hesitated, then took it. She turned to leave, then paused. "You don't have to forgive me, but I needed you to know I didn't come here to be seen. I came here because I couldn't forget." That night I didn't sleep. I unfolded the paper and read. It wasn't an article. It was a letter to Grace, to me, to anyone who had ever been erased by someone else's version of the truth. She wrote, "Some mothers scream. Some beg the world to listen." But she didn't scream. She remembered. She remembered her child so vividly, so completely, that forgetting her became impossible for all of us. There is dignity in that kind of grief. Not loud, but exact. Not angry, but unwavering. My eyes stung not with pain, but with recognition. She hadn't rewritten my story. She had finally seen it. And more than that, she had chosen to carry it, not out of guilt, but out of respect. Later that week, Victor published it on the same platform that had once butchered my name. This time, the headline read, "The Mother Who Didn't Scream. She Just Wanted to Be Remembered Right." No one edited it, no one sensationalized it. Just my words told through her understanding. When I printed it out, I placed it beside Grace's picture. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone had heard me all the way through. Not because I yelled, but because I stayed. And someone unexpectedly had stayed too. It started with 3 pots: lavender, daisy, and baby's breath. Grace's favorite, the one she used to giggle at whenever we passed the flower stall near the library. I didn't plan to open a memorial garden. At first, I just wanted a place to remember her without being asked to move on, without anyone telling me to try again or stay strong. Thomas helped. He didn't say much. He just cleared the back corner of our yard, laid down soil, and asked, "Do you want a bench or a path?" I said both. Over the next few weeks, neighbors started dropping off cuttings. Some brought seedlings. One woman who barely knew us left a small wind chime with a tag for Grace. May the breeze never forget her name. Every morning I watered the garden. Every afternoon I added one more thing, another memory, another plant. A stone here, a photo laminated in glass there. And one evening I came home to find Thomas kneeling in the far corner, brushing dust off a slab of polished granite. I walked over slowly, unsure what he was doing. Then I saw it. He had placed a simple plaque beneath the tallest tree right where Grace's baby shoes had been buried on her first birthday. The engraving read, "A little girl who taught her mother that truth does not need anger, it needs courage." I stood frozen. It was the first time someone had written something about me, about us, that didn't need editing. I sank to my knees beside him. "She never even learned to read," I whispered, "but she rewrote my life." Thomas nodded, and now her story can grow. Like this. Word spread quietly. Soon people started visiting. Some left flowers. Others just stood in silence. A teenage boy came with his mom. He held a small toy bunny. For her, he said, "I lost my sister too." I didn't speak much during these visits. I just watched and breathed. For the first time, I didn't feel like a woman with a past. I felt like a keeper of something living. One Saturday, I saw Denise at the gate. She didn't come in, just stood there holding a small bouquet of violets. Her eyes scanned the garden like she was seeing something she didn't expect, something fragile and whole. I didn't wave, but I didn't turn away either. That night, I lit the lanterns. The wind moved gently through the leaves, through the wind chimes, through Grace's name whispered across petals. And I realized this wasn't just a garden. It was the only place where grief and memory could bloom together without shame, and where truth could be planted, not shouted, not forced, just quietly grown. The room was quiet, filled with a circle of chairs and a single screen behind me. I stood at the front, breathing in the silence I used to fear. Now I honored it. Projected on the screen in soft white text were the words, "Justice doesn't always need a courtroom." I looked out at the faces before me. Some were mothers, some were fathers. A few came alone, gripping the kind of grief that had no form, until it sat in a chair and looked back at them. "My name is Claire." I began, my voice steady. 2 years ago, I lost my daughter Grace. She was only 2. I didn't expect anyone to cry. I didn't want them to. I didn't want pity. I wanted them to hear truth. I used to think silence protected me. I continued that if I just stayed quiet, if I didn't cause trouble, people would eventually care. They didn't. I paused, letting the room hold that truth. And when I lost Grace, I said the silence I used to wear, like armor, became a grave. No one moved, no one blinked. I could see myself in them, the way they sat with hands clenched tight, afraid that if they opened up, they'd fall apart in front of strangers. But silence, I said, isn't the end. Sometimes it's where we begin. We begin by acknowledging that we're here, that our pain exists, that our children mattered. I walked toward the edge of the chairs, slow and intentional. "You don't need a gavel or a headline to find justice," I said. "You need the courage to speak your child's name out loud, to not let their story end in whispers." A man in the back wiped his glasses. A young woman looked down at a bracelet, fingers tracing a tiny engraved name. "I'm not here to inspire you," I finished. "I'm here to remind you that your silence doesn't protect the past, but your voice might protect the future." They didn't clap, but they stayed. That was enough. Later that night, I returned home to the room that used to belong to Grace. Her walls had faded just a little, like memories do when you're not looking. I sat by her old dresser, opened the smallest drawer, and placed a card inside. It read, "I'm still here, Grace, every day." Mom, no big speech, no closing line, just truth. I looked around the room at the empty crib. We had never moved, at the night lamp, shaped like a star, still faintly glowing, though it hadn't been turned on in months. I remembered the way she'd grip my finger before falling asleep, the soft sighs, the way she once called me sunshine after I had a bad day. I thought of my parents. I thought of Eric. And for once, I didn't feel rage. I felt distance. Not absence, but space, the kind you build when you no longer need validation to exist. Grace had lived, she had loved, and because of her, I had changed the course of silence for others. Before leaving the room, I touched the edge of her blanket. The wind outside stirred the curtains, and I whispered, "You were never a secret, Grace, and you never will be." Then I turned off the light, not to forget, but to rest.